The heavy, salted air of the Maine coast lunged into my lungs as I stood on the threshold of a life I no longer recognized, my hand frozen on the cold chrome of the taxi door. Behind me, the sprawling Victorian estate of Blackwood Manor loomed like a silent witness to 3 decades of a marriage I had believed was built on granite, but was now revealing itself to be nothing more than shifting sand. I was 62 years old, a woman of refined tastes and a quiet life, or so I had been told by the man currently smiling at me from the porch, with a warmth that felt increasingly like a fever dream. The rain was starting to fall, a fine, biting mist that blurred the horizon, but nothing was as blurred as the expression on Matteo's face as he suddenly lunged forward, his aged, dirt-stained hand clamping onto my wrist with a strength that defied his 70 years. "Mrs. Sterling, please?" he hissed, his breath smelling of damp earth and the peppermint tea he drank to soothe his joints, his eyes darting toward the house with a terror that made my blood run cold. "Do not get in that car. If you value the soul your mother gave you, you must stay. Trust the man who sees the roots, not the man who only admires the blossoms." The urgency in Matteo's voice was a jagged blade cutting through the soft fabric of my confusion. My husband Arthur was watching us from the top of the stone steps, his tailored cashmere coat perfectly draped over his broad shoulders, a man who at 66 still held the commanding presence of the architect who had reshaped the city's skyline. He was the man I had loved since the summer of 1991, the man who had promised to protect me from the world, and yet as I looked at the gardener's trembling hand on my arm, the world felt safer than my own home. I made a split-second decision that felt like a betrayal of my own history. I feigned a sudden sharp, dizzy spell, clutching my forehead and leaning into the taxi's frame. "Arthur, my heart." I forgot my heart medication on the nightstand. I called out, my voice trembling with a genuine fear I hoped he would interpret as fragility. The taxi driver glanced at his watch, but Arthur's smile didn't falter, though his eyes narrowed in a way that suggested a ledger being calculated. "Go on, Elena," he shouted back, his voice projecting a rehearsed patience. "I'll bring it to you." But I didn't wait. I apologized to the driver, pressed a $100 bill into his hand, and told him I couldn't leave just yet. As the car pulled away, I didn't go back to the house. I slipped through the dense rhododendron bushes, my silk skirt tearing on the thorns, and vanished into the shadows of the old guest house at the edge of the cliff. From the dusty, light-starved window of the guest house, I watched the architecture of my life begin to crumble. Blackwood Manor had been my sanctuary for 24 years, ever since the inheritance from my father's textile empire had made the purchase possible. It was a house of secrets, of high ceilings and hidden alcoves, but the greatest secret was currently pacing the driveway. I watched Arthur emerge from the front door, his face no longer a mask of concern, but a contorted map of frustration. He paced the gravel, his phone pressed to his ear, his gestures sharp and violent. He wasn't looking for his wife. He was looking for a missing piece of a plan. An hour crawled by each minute, a slow drop of acid on my nerves, until a black van with windows so dark they looked like voids pulled into the driveway. My breath hitched in my throat as 2 men stepped out. One was a stranger, tall and clinical, in a dark suit, but the other was Silas Thorne, a man who had been Julian's business partner and our closest family friend for 30 years. Silas was a man of law and procedure, a man who had helped me settle my parents' estate, and seeing him there at an hour when we should have been halfway to our celebratory trip in Venice felt like a final absolute confirmation of a nightmare. As I sat on the floor of the guest house, the cold stone seeping through my clothes, my mind retreated into the sanctuary of memory, trying to find the moment the rot had started. We were supposed to be celebrating our 34th anniversary. Venice Elena Arthur had whispered only that morning, his hands resting on my shoulders as we looked out at the churning Atlantic. Just you and me. No phones, no business, just the ghosts of our younger selves. I had been so touched, so blinded by the romanticism of the gesture, that I hadn't questioned why he had packed my bags for me, or why he had insisted on handling all the travel documents himself. I hadn't questioned the new vitamins he had been bringing me every morning for the past month, the small blue capsules he claimed were essential for my waning energy levels. Looking back, the signs were as clear as the main horizon on a winter day. My occasional bouts of confusion, the way I would find myself in a room and forget why I had entered the subtle way, Arthur would correct my memories of conversations we'd never had. It was all a carefully constructed stave. He was building a case, and I was the unsuspecting lead actress in a tragedy designed to end in my own erasure. Matteo appeared at the guest house door like a spectre, his silhouette framed by the gathering storm. He entered without a word and sat on the wooden crate across from me, his presence a solid grounding force in the chaos. "I've been hearing them for months, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "They think an old gardener is part of the landscape, like a stone or a tree. They talk in the garden by the roses your mother loved. Mr. Sterling and that man Thorne. They talk about the Millbrook Institute. They talk about a woman who has lost her mind and needs to be kept in a cage of silk and iron." My heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. The Millbrook Institute was a private psychiatric facility in the mountains, a place for the wealthy and the broken where reputations were preserved and people were forgotten. Matteo leaned forward, his eyes burning with a fierce protective light. "He's been poisoning your thoughts, ma'am. Those blue pills, I saw him grinding them into your tea when he thought I was trimming the hedges. He wants the trust. He wants the Sterling name without the Sterling wife. The trust. My father had left me a fortune in the tens of millions, a legacy meant to ensure the Sterling name remained a beacon of philanthropy and prestige. But Arthur, for all his architectural genius, had a hunger that could not be sated. He had made bad investments, gambled on soaring developments that had turned into sinkholes of debt, and now he was looking at me not as his partner, but as a bank vault with a human heart. I felt a cold, hard resolve begin to form in the center of my being, replacing the shattered remains of my love. I was Elena Sterling, the daughter of a man who had built empires, and I would not be disposed of like a piece of outdated furniture. "Matteo," I whispered, my voice finding a strength I hadn't felt in years. "How long do we have the old man check the heavy brass watch on his wrist?" "They are in the study now. They are signing the papers that say you are a danger to yourself. They think the taxi took you to a hotel where they will pick you up and take you to the mountains. They don't know you're still on the grounds." I knew I had to see the evidence for myself, using the secret passage that ran from the guest house to the main basement, a relic of the house's days as a stop on the Underground Railroad that Arthur had forgotten about. I made my way into the bowels of Blackwood Manor. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and the damp chill of the earth. I emerged behind the false wall in Arthur's private study, peering through the carved mouldings of the mahogany cabinets. The room was bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace, a cosy scene that belied the treachery unfolding within. Arthur was sitting at his desk, a glass of 20-year-old Scotch in his hand, while Silas Thorne stood over a stack of documents, his pen moving with a clinical efficiency. "It's for the best," Arthur Silas was saying, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Elena has been deteriorating for years. The records, Doctor. Miller has been keeping the ones you've been providing the data for are quite comprehensive. No court will question the necessity of an emergency commitment, especially after the incident with the kitchen knife last week." The incident with the kitchen knife. I gripped the wooden slats behind the wall so hard my knuckles turned white. There had been no such incident. I had been cutting bread for dinner when Arthur had startled me, and I had dropped the knife. He had made a joke about it, then a playful comment about my clumsiness. Now it was being reframed as a violent outburst, a symptom of a fracturing mind. Arthur sighed, a sound of practiced sorrow. I know, Silas. It breaks my heart to see her this way. But she's not the woman I married. She's a shell. And the Sterling Foundation needs a leader who can navigate the coming years, not someone who can't remember her own anniversary. He leaned back, his eyes catching the light of the fire, and the insurance Silas tapped a separate folder. 5 million payable upon permanent institutionalization due to cognitive collapse. It's all in order. We just need to find her. She didn't check into the hotel. I had heard enough. I retreated back through the passage, my mind a storm of its own. I met Matteo back in the guest house, where the rain was now lashing against the windows with a primitive fury. They are coming for me, I told him, but the fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. They think I am a victim, Matteo. They think I am a ghost. But a ghost can see through walls. I need you to help me with one thing. I need to get to the city, to the office of Judge Margaret Halloway. She was my father's protégée, a woman who values the law above any friendship. If I can show her what they've done, if I can show her the blue pills and the timeline this house of cards will fall. Matteo nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. My truck is in the barn, ma'am. They won't be looking for an old gardener's truck in this weather. The drive to the city was a descent into a grey, watery abyss. The wind whipped the trees into frenzied shapes, and the road was a treacherous ribbon of slick asphalt. Matteo drove with a steady, silent focus, while I sat in the passenger seat, clutching the small bag of blue pills I had managed to snatch from the kitchen drawer on my way out. I looked at the man beside me, a man I had known for 15 years, but had never truly seen. I had treated him with the polite distance of an employer, never realizing that he was the only true friend I had in this world of gilded lies. Matteo, I said, the words feeling heavy in the quiet of the truck. Why risk everything for me? He didn't look away from the road, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Because truth is the only thing that grows when you water, Mrs. Sterling. Lies just rot the roots until the whole tree falls over. I've spent my life watching things grow. I wasn't going to let them cut you down. Judge Halloway's residence was a modest brick townhouse in a neighborhood that whispered of old money and quiet power. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in shock at the sight of me, drenched, disheveled, and looking every bit like the woman the document said I was. Elena, she gasped, drawing me into the warmth of her foyer. What on earth has happened? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the blue pills on her antique hall table, the white light of the chandelier catching their clinical sheen. Margaret, I am not crazy, I said, my voice as steady as the granite cliffs of Blackwood. My husband is poisoning me. He is trying to steal my life, my name, and my father's legacy. I told her everything, the trip to Venice, that was a trip to the madhouse, the insurance policy, the fictional violence, and the man named Silas Thorne, who was presiding over it all like a dark priest. The judge's face went from shock to a cold judicial fury as I showed her the photographs I had taken of the timeline in Arthur's study. I had used my phone to capture the neat architectural script of my own destruction. Margaret sat at her desk, her eyes scanning the documents with the precision of a hawk. This is not just a betrayal, Elena, she whispered. This is a crime of the highest order. It is a systematic attempt to erase a human being for profit. She picked up her phone, her fingers moving with a purpose that sent a surge of hope through my chest. I am calling the district attorney, and I am issuing an emergency restraining order against Arthur Sterling and Silas Thorne. We are going to take your house back. But the battle was only beginning. We returned to Blackwood Manor in the early hours of the morning, accompanied by 3 police cruisers. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the house sat in the pre-dawn light like a tomb. When we entered the study, Arthur and Silas were still there, huddled over a bottle of brandy, their faces pale with the exhaustion of a night spent searching for a woman they thought they had already conquered. When they saw me standing there, flanked by the law and the truth, the silence was so profound, I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking like a heartbeat. Arthur stood up, his face a mask of feigned relief that quickly curdled into terror. "Elena, thank God, we've been searching everywhere." He moved toward me, his arms outstretched, but the lead officer stepped between us. "Mr. Sterling, you need to step back," the officer said, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "We have an emergency order, and we have questions regarding the chemical substances found on these premises." I watched as the man I had loved for 34 years collapsed into a chair, the architecture of his arrogance finally failing him. Silas Thorne tried to bluster his lawyer's mind, already spinning a web of defense, but it was useless. The blue pills were sent to the lab, where they were found to be a sophisticated blend of mild sedatives and hallucinogens designed to create a state of chronic disorientation without leaving a trace in a standard blood test. The investigation into Arthur's finances revealed a black hole of debt, a secret life of high-stakes gambling that had consumed millions of the Foundation's assets. The man who built skyscrapers had been living in a basement of lies. The legal battle that followed was a spectacle of public ruin. I sat in the courtroom every day, a woman of 62 who had finally learned to see the world without the filter of a husband's expectations. I watched as Arthur was sentenced to 12 years for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. I watched as Silas Thorne was disbarred and sent to prison for his role in the scheme. The Sterling name was dragged through the mud, but in the end it emerged cleaner than it had been in years. I spent the next 18 months liquidating the assets that had been tainted by Arthur's greed, refocusing the Foundation on the protection of the elderly and the vulnerable, the very people who are often silenced by the ones they trust the most. I stayed at Blackwood Manor, but I changed it. I tore down the high walls that had hidden the garden from the road, and I opened the house to the community as a centre for legal advocacy. Matteo became the head of the grounds, but also a board member of the Foundation, a man whose wisdom was finally recognized as the treasure it was. We often sat on the porch together in the evenings, watching the sun set over the Atlantic, the air no longer feeling like a threat, but like a promise. "Mrs. Sterling," he said one evening as the first stars began to pierce the main sky, "the roses are doing well this year. They finally found the sun." I looked at the vibrant red blooms swaying in the breeze, their beauty no longer a mask for something darker. "Yes, Matteo," I replied, my heart finally at peace. "They have." But the true lesson of my journey didn't come from the courtroom or the victory over Arthur. It came from the quiet moments of reflection in the guest house, the place where I had hidden as a fugitive in my own home. I realized that for 34 years I had been an architect of my own imprisonment. I had built a life on the assumption that love was a shield, never realizing that a shield can also be a wall. I had allowed my own identity to be subsumed by the man I married, trusting his vision of the world over my own instinct. The betrayal was not just Arthur's, it was my own failure to remain the guardian of my own soul. As I walked through the halls of Blackwood Manor, now the house felt lighter, as if the shadows had been chased away by the sheer force of the truth. I realized that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a man with a plan or a bottle of pills. It is the silence we maintain in the face of our own intuition. We are taught to be polite, to be agreeable, to ignore the small, cold voice in the back of our minds that tells us something is wrong. We are taught to value the structure of our lives over the substance of our heart. But the structure can always be rebuilt. The heart once broken by a silence it cannot endure is much harder to mend. The Sterling Foundation for Elder Advocacy became my life's work. I met countless women and men who had been victims of the same kind of gilded vanishing that had almost claimed me. I saw the same look of fractured trust in their eyes, the same disbelief that the ones they loved could be the ones who wanted them gone. I told them my story not as a tragedy but as a blueprint for survival. I told them that the first step to freedom is not running away, but standing still and looking at the architecture of your life with unclouded eyes. I told them that the gardener often knows more than the architect, because the gardener knows that you cannot force a life to grow. You can only provide the conditions for its truth to emerge. 3 years after the night in the taxi, I received a letter from the prison where Arthur was serving his time. It was a long, rambling confession filled with the same elegant script and the same self-pitying tone that had once charmed me. He spoke of the pressures of the industry, the fear of failure, the desperation that had driven him to see me as a solution rather than a person. He asked for my forgiveness, promising that he still loved the woman he had tried to erase. I read the letter twice, then walked to the fireplace in the study, the same fireplace where he had toasted to my destruction, and dropped it into the flames. Forgiveness is a beautiful thing, but it cannot be built on the ashes of a lie. I didn't hate him anymore. I simply didn't recognize him. He was a ghost of a life. I had outgrown a man who had built a tower of glass and forgotten that glass is the easiest thing in the world to shatter. I walked out onto the cliffs, the wind whipping my silver hair around my face. The ocean was a churning, magnificent beast, a reminder of the power that lies beneath the surface of things. I felt the weight of my father's legacy on my shoulders, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a foundation. I was Elena Sterling, and I was no longer a victim of the vanishing. I was the one who had stayed. I was the one who had seen the roots. And as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, leaving a trail of fire on the water, I knew that the architecture of my life was finally, for the first time, my own. The human spirit is a resilient thing, much like the winter roses that Matteo tended with such care. It can endure the biting frost of betrayal and the suffocating darkness of a lie, but it will always reach for the light. We are all, in our own way, architects of our own reality. We choose which walls to build and which windows to open. We choose who to trust with the keys to our sanctuary. And sometimes the greatest act of love is not holding on, but having the courage to let go of the illusions that keep us from seeing the truth of who we are. The truth is not always beautiful, and it is rarely easy, but it is the only ground upon which a real life can be built. I looked back at Blackwood Manor, the lights in the windows glowing like beacons in the gathering dark. It was no longer a house of secrets. It was a house of stories. And mine was just beginning. I realized that age is not a decline, but an accumulation of clarity. The older we get, the less we need the grand gestures and the soaring towers, and the more we need the quiet strength of the man who sees the root. I had found my strength in the most unlikely of places, in the dirt and the rain and the whisper of a gardener. And as I turned back toward the house, I knew that no matter what storms the future might bring, the foundation would hold. For a life built on the truth is a life that can never truly be erased. It is a masterpiece that belongs to the one who lived it, a testament to the enduring power of the soul to find its way home no matter how far it has been led astray. In the end, we are all just travelers on a long, winding road, looking for a place where we can finally put down our bags and be known. I had found that place not in a foreign city or a gilded cage, but in the honesty of my own heart. The vanishing had been a gift, a terrible, beautiful gift that had stripped away everything that wasn't real until only the truth remained. And the truth was this: I was alive, I was free, and I was finally, for the first time in 62 years, exactly where I was meant to be. The Maine coast continued its eternal conversation with the sea, a rhythm of survival and change that would outlast us all. And I stood there, a witness to the dawn, ready to write the next chapter of a story that was finally, irrevocably mine. The lesson of my life is a simple one, though it took me a lifetime to learn. Trust the whisper over the shout. Trust the hand that is covered in dirt over the hand that is covered in gold. And above all, trust the silence that tells you the truth over the words that tell you what you want to hear. For the architecture of a life is not measured by the height of its walls, but by the depth of its honesty. And in that depth there is a beauty that no lie can ever touch. It is the beauty of a soul that has walked through the fire and come out on the other side, not burned, but forged into something that can never be broken. This is the harvest of the silent betrayal, the wisdom that grows from the rot, the light that emerges from the shadow. It is the story of the one who stayed, the one who saw, and the one who finally learned to breathe in the open air. As I closed the door to the study, I looked at the portrait of my father on the wall. He seemed to be smiling now, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. I had not only preserved his legacy, I had redeemed it. I had taken the wealth and the name and turned them into a shield for those who had none. I had turned a house of secrets into a house of sanctuary. And as I walked up the stairs to my room, the floorboards creaking with a familiar, comforting sound, I knew that the ghosts of Blackwood Manor were finally at rest. The vanishing was over. The story was told, and the truth, like the morning sun, was finally beginning to rise over the sea, a promise of a day that would be built on nothing but the light.